right, and we are live. Thank you everybody so much for joining us today for our OpenJS Foundation Ask Me Anything. This month, I'm really excited to be featuring the AMP project TSC. AMP project joined the OpenJS Foundation as a growth project this summer. We're super excited to have them as part of the big family. And today we will have Nana from the AMP project moderating our AMA. But before I hand it over, I just wanted to give folks a quick update on how you can ask your questions. You can drop them into the YouTube chat. You can use the hashtag AskAMP on Twitter, or you can tag at OpenJSF on Twitter as well. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Nina and the AMP TSC.
Thanks, Rachel. As Rachel mentioned, my name is Nana Raisinghani, and I'm a PM on the AMP project. I have the absolute honor of actually moderating this Q&A, but I'll hand it off to the TSC, which is our technical steering committee, to introduce themselves, and I'll go across the screen. David, do you want to kick us off?
Hi, I'm David Strauss. I joined the AMP TSC I guess we mostly joined at the formation of the TSC, and I primarily work on the Drupal project and on a website hosting platform that delivers many sites for that use AMP pages. And I'm happy to be answering questions today about the my own perspectives on the direction of the project.
Chris, do you want to take us off next?
Hi, I'm Chris Papazian. I also joined the TSC at formation with David. I'm a software engineer at Pinterest, and I've been using AMP since, I guess, late 2016.
That's 4 years now. Dima? You're muted, Dima.
Apologies. Hi, Dima is here. My name is Dima Vaitenko. I am software engineer at Google. I've been a part of AMP project from beginning, and I've been a member of TSC from beginning as well.
Malta.
Hey, I'm Malta. Together with Dima, I originally made AMP, and working at Google, leading the team that's working on it there full time, and obviously also a member of the TSC since it started.
According to Wikipedia, a full-time job is important.
This is great.
I'll just keep it running because it's funny.
Good to know it comes with benefits. Cassiana, do you want to introduce yourself next?
Hi, I'm Cassiana McClenahan. I'm a product manager at Axios. We launched basically an all AMP site in February 2020. I am the newest member to the TSC. I just joined kind of after we launched our site, and I'm very excited about the technology.
Welcome again. Saulo, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hey, everybody. I'm Saulo. I'm an engineering manager at Microsoft. I work mainly on Bing.com, and the reason I'm in the steering committee is because like my team has implemented the Bing AMP cache, so we have brought AMP to the Microsoft services as well. So I'm very excited to be here today.
And Rudy, you're lost.
Hey everyone, I'm Rudy Galfie. I'm a product management lead at Google, focusing on AMP, and I've been with the TSC since we got that started back in 2018, and with the project since we started it back in 2015.
Right, that's everyone that's here today. Just to get folks started, since this is still part of, we had AmpFest yesterday. I was just curious, what was the one topic you were excited to learn about, or just have our audience learn about going into AmpFest, and what's the one thing you actually learned at AmpFest? And if you learned nothing, that is also good because that's working as intended. I'll pick on Chris.
AMP Fest yesterday. I actually didn't make any of the talks yesterday, but I'm excited about, let's see, what am I most excited about AMP and the direction of AMP? I think generally one of the really cool things about AMP is how a lot of the technology that started as AMP only is really making it into the web ecosystem. And so we're particularly excited about signed exchanges and how that might help us improve page load experience. And even though it doesn't get a lot of press with AMP, it's more part of the Chrome ecosystem these days. I feel like it's really important to the AMP story. So I'm pretty excited about that.
Yeah, broadening that question, is there anything else that the AMP project has accomplished in 2020 that folks here are really proud of or really excited by? David.
I'm really excited about the work on Mtsc because I've often seen one of the biggest strengths of AMP is that it provides a brightly lit path toward providing good performance while taking into account a lot of competing considerations. And I feel like Mtsc just puts stadium lighting on the path in the sense that it provides all the more ability to winnow down onto the issues that are actually affecting a site and actually get to the heart of delivering not just pages that are AMP compliant for delivery that are often going to deliver great performance, but even optimizing forward from that point.
Yeah, as someone who worked on it, we're incredibly excited about the fact that, you know, this pushes the AMP promise for page experience even further. It's like we promise you that, yes, in a very large amount of cases, you'll be set. You don't have to do anything just as long as you're on the AMP path. But in the few cases where you need to like go implement web development, web best practices, what are the AMP specific actions you can take there? We're really excited by that. And the fact that, you know, you have this exit where if you really don't understand what's going on or you really can't understand why your page isn't performing well, you have that route back to the AMP project or like the performance working group. So yeah, if folks want to use that, that's it, self-plug, amp.dev/page-experience. You should absolutely go test your AMP page today and let us know if you have any feedback. Anything else that folks want to talk about something they're proud of that the project achieved in 2020?
I wanted to bring up also Web Vitals. We were working quite a bit on them this year, and it's a very exciting direction. It feels like AMP has done a lot of work in this area, and we also are going to have a lot about. We also have a lot to do next year to make sure that the experience on the web just raises to a new bar, to a new height.
So this is kind of a new thing, and it's also like a bit of what you learn by attending, I guess, virtually an event like AMP Fest for me, which is like getting to see the usage of AMP by different people. So, you know, whether it's like some of the work, you know, in the WordPress space or things like AMP for email usage, like these are things that I don't often get to see each day, especially things like email where you literally kind of have to be sent the email to kind of get the experience. You can't just like go to a link. So so I think that's what's cool about things like AMP Fest is getting to kind of shine a light on some of the use cases and adoption that we're seeing amongst people to help like, you know, make that use case of email better. So that would kind of be a bright spot for me. The other thing that I think has advanced a lot over the past year has been stories. So you know, maybe we'll talk more about stories here in the session too, but that's another call I'd have is I think stories is like a super cool product, and it's great to see the strides that's been taking over the course of 2020.
I'll queue up a question from YouTube. Ishan Anand asked that one of the biggest concerns about AMP is that it was a Google project, but they're excited to see that, you know, Bing also supported. And in that way, can the TSC give an update on what other popular platforms actually support AMP, especially with privacy preserving pre-rendering?
I'll take this one. I think that Microsoft and Google are the only one that are doing pre-rendering. Although the same technology is basically what enables AMP for email. But so from a, there are obviously other platforms that link to AMP document. I think the one I personally use the most is Twitter. There's Pinterest, LinkedIn, etc. So I think it's a pretty broad base actually, and I think it's definitely interesting to see how that mechanism that kind of was designed to be privacy preserving, and that it like tightly controlled where requests are being made and when would eventually enable use cases like AMP for email where like user expectations are very different compared to the web, and we were able to kind of fit kind of the web programming model into something that matches users' expectation in emails.
And then to that end, like since we brought up email, we know that folks at Yahoo just launched their developer preview as well for AMP for email. And we're excited that more like ESPs and more senders are also supporting it. We had a talk at AmpFest about some senders who are seeing success with AMP for email. And we also announced that Salesforce Marketing Cloud would be launching support, I believe, in Q1 of 2021. So we're seeing adoption for different formats also in a bunch of places. Since Rudy brought up stories, I'll jump off of that and ask, what do you think is the most critical piece that the AMP project can contribute to actually see things like web stories see like in amazing scale?
I can try to take this one. So as I've been super impressed with stories since the beginning. I've expressed even internally in Microsoft like a lot of interest for using the platform, and I'm super happy that actually Google started pushing more stories and actually has a dedicated experience to stories, and that makes it easier for any developer, like any company, to go ahead and create an experience based on stories, right? And that's super rich because it's so complex to interaction models, all the features, and that's all given by AMP to the developer to just use it. So it simplifies the developer cycle. And if you are a smaller developer, like a smaller company that wants to leverage that, you don't need to create all your infrastructure to do that. It's all given to you. So it scales much better. And it brings a richness that it's super rare to see anywhere else in any component or in any framework. So I'm a big fan of stories. Really like it.
One thing I'd like to add is, it's specifically talked about like what AMP can do, and I think it has a little bit of a different role compared to the website space, in that the main customer of AMP in the web story space is actually the makers of the tools. And the powerful thing is that there are these like no-code Visivik tools that allow people to make these stories. And so I think the main job actually of AMP is to just make sure that the format is a good kind of target for these tools so that they can do a good job. But it's a bit of an indirect relationship, but I think it's still very powerful.
One thing I will add, though, that I think is super cool is the story player that is being built out for stories. So, I think when stories first launched, it was basically like, okay, this is a web page, and it renders in a certain way, it has certain sort of navigational like behaviors to how it works, interaction models. But it was kind of just like a standalone thing. And like what I think is cool about the web player or the story player project is that we can like have a better way for sites to think about sort of integrating stories to be displayed as part of like their core flows. And so I think that that's like gonna be something that helps like make the mental model sort of click more for people, and it will hopefully like enable better experiences, especially just directly on the origin of the site, to be able to kind of facilitate navigation and provide like more layers of customization and be able to like handle presentation of stories on websites.
Anything else that folks want to mention on the stories one? Otherwise, I'll flip to email because I'm curious about this. So what's one use case that folks actually want to see an AMP for email for? Like what one problem would you like AMP for email to solve for you? Be it productivity, be it getting food delivery, or really anything in the consumer or enterprise space.
I have one. So I mean, I've been where for me, like just personally, it has been really powerful is when it shortcuts workflows. So really in the enterprise space. So I get a lot of comment notifications from Google Doc, and being able to like see more context inline, see the latest comment inline instead of just the email in reverse order has just been really powerful. And then not having to kind of jump back into the relatively slow loading document to actually do the reply was powerful. And I think recently they've looked also into like approving of permission requests, right? Which is another thing where you can just kind of shortcut that process. And so since you were asking what I would like to see, like just again, like me personally, like I get a lot of GitHub notifications, and if I could, and I like to use email for them because for me, I live in my inbox as opposed to like the GitHub inbox for notifications is, I mean, there's also people who like that, but like that's not what I do. And so if I could do more things in my email. So for example, if I have a code review and I get like the done reply, and I trust the person, I would like to be able to say like approve, right, and then be done, and don't have to jump back into GitHub, click like 15 buttons and do the work.
As a publisher, I think one of the things that like I'm personally very excited about is Axios has a really large email newsletter business. It seems a little outdated, but it turns out that's actually kind of a great way to get your news. The problem is that when we send out an email, we have no idea if you live on the East Coast or the West Coast. And so if we send an email at 5:30 a.m. East Coast time, by the time you're actually reading that on the West Coast, it may be 6 or 7 hours out of date. And so I think that that's actually a really nice way to start to think about how you can pull dynamic content into like what previously has been a very static platform, and kind of make yourself a little time zone agnostic.
Oh, 100%.
For me, once COVID-19 is over, I would like to be able to make decisions on what restaurant me and my friends go to and what exact time.
Yeah, it seems like a good fit for anything that's transactional. The cynic in me says unsubscribe would be a good use case, but anything that's kind of a clear action that you can take, extending specific discrete actions from a product experience into email seems like a great use case.
I'm hoping it means I get to unsubscribe a lot less, in the sense that you can basically send something that's almost like an evergreen email that like, here's the email that represents the state of your order, and be able to provide different interactions and capabilities in it, and in ways where I don't necessarily have to get a pile of transactional emails for each interaction with the site.
Yeah, well, making unsubscribe easier keeps senders honest, I think. We see that in our email program.
Right. One other question was, right, so the New York Times, along with some other publishers, released a proposal for content aggregation technologies and like a framework how to think them through. Does the TSC have any opinions here, or thoughts for folks who've like actually had the chance to like consume it so far?
I'll do a first answer, and then maybe others have more to say. First of all, I think it's really important to say that the TSC as an entity does not have an opinion about this, because this came out on Monday, and our next regular meeting is next Wednesday, and we, I'm not sure it's on the agenda there, but like we certainly haven't discussed it, right? And most of us probably haven't read it. I mean, I personally also have only skimmed it. I think my main reaction is, first of all, I have to say, I've tweeted this 5 years ago, that the original name of of AMP was CAT for Content Authoring Toolkit. And we were not allowed to use it because our lawyers were afraid of getting sued by Caterpillar. And I was just very, very disappointed because the internet is made of cats, and it would have made a really good name. So I'm very excited about the name. They found a better backronym than Content Authoring Toolkit, and it's great. So that's good. And so the second part to my reply, a little bit more in depth, is that I like. So I think this is generally a good idea, right? Like I'm excited that the New York Times is working on this. I mean, they haven't reached out to us, so that it would be good to have a conversation. I certainly disagree with some of the representations that are being made in the document, but I think that's fine, and people can iterate on it. I think it's especially since it's concretely names like different technologies like Apple News and Facebook Instant Articles. I think AMP is different. It has a TSC, right? That isn't just like one proprietary company. There's a representation for Microsoft who have literally their own major integration, and we have like meetings like this one, right? Like you can't go to the Apple News committee live stream. That does not exist, right? And then you can't even probably talk to anyone there, right? Like so, it's like fundamentally different. And so honestly, like that's just me personally, the main thing I'm worried about is I think we're most likely the TSC is going to be open to this and say like, hey, let's have a conversation at the very least, right? Like, why wouldn't you say yes to this? But if there are no similar signals from other members of the platform aggregator community, like those named in the document from Apple and Facebook, then I mean, I'm not super convinced this is going to be the most productive process, right? So I think it's going to be crucial for the New York Times, and I think they're in a leadership position that they might be able to do this, to actually bring these other companies on the table, so that you don't get this famous XKCD outcome where you complain about 13 standards and you have 14. So I think that's one of the things I'm worried about, but nevertheless, I'm pretty optimistic that this is a good approach.
Perfect. Next. Sorry.
Like one quick thing, I think what Malta said is salient for this point. I think what is helpful as a publisher is that I do think that there are parts of the CAT document that identify real problems that we do have. And so I think it's really helpful to at least start that conversation and see whether there are ways that we can make it better. In general, publishers do have pretty small dev teams, and we are then asked to create these kind of bespoke formats to be able to sort of appear in all these various distribution platforms. I think one of the real benefits that we saw in AMP is that it's also sort of creating a better user experience that's accessible to anybody on the web, not just somebody participating in kind of the walled garden ecosystem of one of these other aggregation platforms. And so for us, I think that was sort of what made it like an attractive standard to kind of adhere to. So I think that it's certainly a worthwhile conversation to have, and would, is at least a proposal for addressing a real pain point.
I wanted to add that from a beginning, we really were trying to make AMP as embeddable as possible. And it's obviously a lot more complicated than just being able to display images and maybe cache them. And as an example, in our access and subscription tools, as an example here, Google News can, when publisher opts in, can actually replace checkout flow to be native on an Android platform from, instead of running some sort of a checkout platform in a web view, which probably would fail. There's a lot of these kind of features we've already had a fairly solid experience with. So I think it's definitely worth having a conversation.
So speaking of conversations and thinking about how to involve AMP in more open standards work. What are problems that the TSC is actively thinking about going into the new year? I know it's around time where organizations are thinking about 2021. Hopefully it happens and we don't just get a repeat of 2020. But yeah, how are folks thinking about the new year and any efforts that the AMP project should be picking up?
I'm still really interested in watching the capabilities and adoption around signed exchange, in the sense that there's still a relatively high barrier to entry, I think, on deploying the infrastructure at origin, and but it provides enough benefits from a content loading perspective, especially as part of the increasingly leveled playing field represented by Core Web Vitals, that I don't know that it's our unique burden to shoulder, but I think that it's a potential barrier to performance capabilities that the next year may be a bit make or break for in terms of adoption.
Can I really quickly say that we're in the awkward conversation where the person asking the question is the most qualified person to answer it? So always feel free to also, give me your opinion.
I'd echo David. I mean, signed exchange adoption, seeing where that goes. We've struggled with our own kind of adoption at Pinterest and trying to figure out how that fits in. And then I think that combined with Core Web Vitals is really interesting. Core Web Vitals rolled out, but it's been stated that it's gonna, it's the metrics that are part of Core Web Vitals today are not necessarily what are always going to be part on how that's composed. So seeing how that kind of changes over time and evolves with the web is super interesting, and staying up to speed on that. And generally seeing how AMP and the metrics that we think about as the performance metrics, how they, the interplay between the two ecosystems is really interesting.
One thing maybe Dima can later give some technical details. I think Bento continues to be super interesting and something I'll learn next year. I think one area of research that I've heard chatter about, which hasn't risen to the level of like proper project, is just kind of trying to compile away more parts of AMP and just be thinner and less of it. The AMP optimizer is kind of the first like real part of this, and you could like think that further through of saying like, hey, can we now that we kind of made that big step that we have software at the origin, can it do more than it does now, and what's the real goal there?
And kind of building into like into next year's planning kind of a question. Which sectors or use cases are the highest priority for the Mtsc? It seems like content is number one. E-commerce seems to be number two, but there weren't any e-commerce case studies featured at AmpFest. So we did have some e-commerce case studies very specifically in like the AMP for email section as well, because I think there's a lot of usefulness there, such as for abandoned cart emails or just account verification. Like one of the use cases I'm really excited to see is if I get an email saying verify account, I shouldn't have to go somewhere else, go to another web page, confirm, and just follow 300 steps there. Should just be able to click within the email. But yeah, how do folks, does the TSC think of that we're going to continue focusing on content publishers, or do we want to expand into more verticals, or just keep our presence in more verticals? And I can also express my opinion here. Cool. I will. In that case, I will. I think going into 2021, the one thing I'm really excited about is page experience and Core Web Vitals and how AMP can really push the boundary there. I think we announced yesterday that about 60% of AMP domains passed the Core Web Vitals criteria compared to like 12% of non-AMP domains, where passing is like at 75% of pages passing the criteria. I'm not happy with anything less than 100%, personally speaking. So I think like we have some ways to go there, and I'm really excited to see the team push that, so that regardless of what vertical you're coming in from, as long as you pick what part of AMP really you will benefit from. So for example, you can pick an AMP carousel because you have a lot of CLS issues and just have a bento AMP page. But really you can pick and choose what bits of AMP work for you to help you solve for your core web vitals or your page experience metrics and problems. So that's something that I'm really excited about, and that allows us to be mostly vertical agnostic as well here.
I'm actually kind of curious to see how web stories could change e-commerce and what role they could play, because I feel like every time I see these nice stories, I almost always want to buy something.
Absolutely. It's the bite-sized consumption. They're like, oh yeah, this looks beautiful and this looks highly polished. Yes, I will order this pair of shoes. Oh, this is not going to be good for my wallet. But going on.
Travel.
Oh yeah. When that's possible, 2022. Or road trips. Folks can do those right now. Question from YouTube. Will websites need to maintain duplicate implementations of articles, that is HTML in an AMP version, to get picked up by publishers, or I assume platforms? I have a very strong stance on paired AMP versus AMP first, but if folks want to go first.
I'm actually really interested in the direction of this over the next couple of years, in the sense that we have two different kind of paths that are emerging now. One of them being the more AMP first direction, where you stay completely on the rails. You take advantage of all of the performance benefits of completely embracing the framework, possibly even as your canonical framework. And then we have this other kind of perspective around things like Bento AMP and Core Web Vitals, where there's more of a sliding scale between different functionality and attributes of the page, and the effects of the balance between capabilities versus performance impacts. And I think that will affect this a lot. One of the stances that we have well represented here is the idea of taking AMP first, which is to build the pages completely in AMP and not have a sort of so I almost chafe at the idea of regular HTML, because AMP is regular HTML in a sense, but it's just a restricted subset of it. And that can be a great way to not have to maintain duplicate articles. But I'm definitely going to be watching how much people also choose to say don't do things that are using the AMP toolkits and are still focused on performance, but not necessarily passing the validator.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's never been explicit need to use a duplicate implementation of AMP alongside a non-AMP version. But what we found over several years is that there is in practice kind of some barriers to really getting there. So I think a lot of the work and the things that I'm excited about heading into 2021 are the approaches by which we'll make AMP more approachable and more flexible for people to adopt in various ways. And Bento is really at the center of this as well. So this idea that you could sort of, instead of having a step function where it's either not valid or valid, there's a graduated path where you can get there over time by using parts of AMP, and that you're sort of while not having a fully valid AMP implementation, you're starting to be able to get some of the benefits along the way, and you can potentially graduate fully up the path to a valid AMP page. I mean, I think it's worth noting one of the really difficult things, and I think a lot of the reason that there's sort of this paired pattern of adoption is it makes it a lot easier to kind of reason about it first and be able to experiment with, with investing in AMP. And so, I think we've recognized that through feedback from the community over the years. And I think that there's a lot of projects now that are really squarely focused on trying to address this pain point. And so I, like David and others have expressed, I'm really excited to see how that plays out, and would love for the community to continue giving us feedback as we go down that path, because at the end of the day, like you all who are really, taking time day in and day out to invest in building out the sites and the pages, will have the best feedback that we can take with us to figure out what to do.
I think our experience might be also kind of salient in here. Axios kind of took a different path, which was that we were going to be, fully rebuilding our site and kind of had this opportunity to make a choice of, which technologies we really wanted to bet on. And we had previously done like a little experiment and like set up an AMP site for the previous iteration of Axios, and had seen clear user benefits from that, and decided that like we knew that AMP was going to be part of the solution, and so we really ended up centering it through our development. I think that now we have a fully AMP site. We are finding some of those pain points, and I will tell you, I raised my hand a lot here to like have those conversations. That's part of why I wanted to join the TSE, was to help us navigate, but also help other publishers kind of navigate the places where like AMP is both great, but there are places where it can be a little bit of a struggle. I do think that I think it is easy to see the places where like, at this point where like AMP can be make our build a little bit more complex. But I do think that there are really strong benefits to the user experience. And I think that those are really highlighted by the Core Web Vitals statistics. So what we're trying to figure out is like, how can we figure out how to kind of fully make this implementation work for us? And I think that is the broad direction that the TSE I think is also engaged in.
So I'll go to the next question. Since we did the word pain points was mentioned, what are some, and like I think this is more asking you all to reflect on your own personal experiences as web developers or folks working with web developers. What are some of the most common web development pain points that your teams have individually experienced, and how can frameworks or how can AMP help here?
Kind of just piggybacking off what Cassiano was saying about pain points and performance. Most of the pain points map directly to an instance where kind of the AMP philosophy puts end user, the end user before the developer, and says that we are not going to compromise performance for one more widget, one more ad, one more kind of A/B experiment that doesn't really necessarily benefit the user. A/B experiments in particular, one, because we really have interest, like we do that a lot, but it kind of conflicts with this privacy preserving preload and this AMP cache. So how do we do both? There's some instance where you can say, hey, you can do an experiment on something that's later in the page load, but something that's part of the initial paint. No, we're not going to call back to origin for that, because that would slow the performance down for the end user. And so those are, I think, clear interests where the decision is that the AMP framework makes is for the user and not for the software company.
I feel like, to be honest, like almost everything is hard. I mean, way too hard. I mean, starting from server-side rendering to hydration on the client side, code splitting, all of these issues that are state-of-the-art, many big sites solving by large teams are still too hard. DOM APIs themselves are at times pretty hard. Try to use history API, and it's you can sink any amount of engineering hours just trying to figure that out. I mean, almost everything is a bit too difficult.
Absolutely agree, 1000%. And I think there's an illusion that sometimes things are easy, but then you get to production and it's slow. So I think AMP puts the pain up front in a lot of cases, and I think that's a strength of AMP. Don't make it seem easy if it's not, I guess, is something that I kind of agree with.
we have a question from YouTube. Sorry, yep. Notice that the first feedback from the AMP page experience guide is to use the AMP optimizer. Wondering about more approachable architectural, wow, this is hard. Wondering about more approachable architectural options for HTML conversion on high volume sites. I think I reached out and asked about a clarification and about the approachable architectural options. But I think for AMP optimizer very specifically, one of the pain points that I want to see addressed going into next year is seeing it be available for more frameworks. Currently, it's available for Next.js. So if you're working in Next.js, you have like optimizer built in. It's not something you have to think about, and that is really, in my opinion, the most ideal use case, right? It just comes for free. It's not something you have to actively think about. But then I know it's available in the WordPress AMP plugin. Netlify, somebody from the community contributed for Netlify as well as we have an integration with 11t, and I want to see it be used in more places automatically, hopefully. And if folks want to take the more broader question.
I can try. I think this, I mean, it's a bit difficult question in the abstract because it's not clear that there's a problem. I think there might be a problem that it takes too much CPU if you have a very large site. And then it depends a little bit on why your site is large. Like if your site is large because it has a lot of pages, then the right strategy is to do it lazily because probably most of them no one ever looks at. Not sure that's true for Chris's site, for example, right? It probably has a lot of web pages that don't get a lot of traffic, right? So like they only exist in theory. And so like that's a very different strategy from from a website that maybe at some point made the decision that static site generator is a good idea, and now they have 100,000 pages, and it takes a long time to deploy them, and adding 100 millisecond per page HTML parsing process times 100,000 isn't fun, right? So these are all very different problems. I think so we haven't heard so much feedback around this. I think where we are seeing one interesting development is that there's a PHP version of this now, and I think and so originally this was like tied into the AMP plugin, but that team took that out and basically just made an AMP optimizer that anyone who has a PHP pipeline can just plug in, independent of using the WordPress plugin. And so one interesting development that was really recently was the release of the C++ AMP Validator that Google is using in production. So that was previously not available open source, and it's available open source now. So you could envision that one could build an AMP optimizer in C++ based on that relatively easily compared to if that wasn't already around. But since we actually haven't heard particular feedback that people use so much electricity optimizing AMP pages, I think it's probably not the priority right now.
We've got another question coming. Do you see AMP focusing more on making better UI components such as Lightbox, Accordion, etc., or deprioritizing those in favor of components that users can build themselves using AMP script?
I'll take this one. This is a tricky one for me because I'm not sure where we end up netting out. There's so one of the things I loved about the kind of concept of AMP when we were initiating the project is the idea that there were these components that were like super approachable, like super semantic, and I feel it made people who are maybe even like newer to web development to be able to like come in and use the AMP library to put together web pages, and they could be really rich in terms of the experience that they provide. Like building a Lightbox or a carousel is a pretty complicated thing to get right, just in terms of like navigation and performance and stuff like that. And so I feel like AMP put a lot of power into your hands while it's kind of getting pretty close to a guarantee that like you would end up in a good state with how you built out that experience, plus all the other stuff that you wanted to do in building up the web page. So that aspect of AMP has always been something that I've really cherished about it. And we have put investment in recent years into things like Lightbox and Carousel to make those better. So I think I could see sort of more continuity of that. It'd be interesting to hear if there's like feedback around specific components where you see there's like opportunities or gaps. On the other hand, and going back maybe a bit to the e-commerce question that came up earlier as well. So things like AMP scripts can actually be used to drive AMP and to get to sort of, you know, more nuanced use cases, you know, be able to get more power out of AMP. And so I think that that has been a path that has been useful in helping to address the e-commerce use cases that we've been looking at over the years. And so, you know, I think to the extent that further investment in that area is merited, I think, you know, that could make sense. But I don't necessarily see us like saying, oh, we're going to see this shift away from like the components toward like, okay, all that stuff becomes scripting as part of AMP script. Like, I don't know if I see that, but you know, I could see maybe a little bit more investment into script and be able to handle some of those more nuanced use cases, power use cases in general. But what I'd also say is like across all of these things, I think what I'm, you know, reiterating what I'm really excited about in 2021, and this is groundwork that we've laid so far this year, has actually been thinking about AMP like super holistically too. Not even along these specific dimensions, like thinking about things like bento and ways that we can make AMP more flexible so that you kind of, you don't just change the details of how you interact with AMP, you kind of change like the whole sort of mindset that you might have in approaching AMP or the options that you see on the table for building with AMP. And so that is like a third kind of path of investment that I think is open to the project. And I do see us investing significantly in that direction in the coming year.
I also wanted to add that high-level semantic components are also much better for accessibility in the sense that when things get implemented that way, as long as the component supports an accessible interface, things like, say, keyboard navigation, various tagging of the function of the element, that comes basically for free with using that element. Whereas if it gets built up from scratch using something like AMP script, in many cases, it just won't be implemented accessibly.
I agree with that. I also, you know, thinking that a lot of the accessible components, they're also accessible to other type of clients, like even search indexers and so on, you know, knowing that semantic information is useful. Personally, every time I open an AMP page, source code, and just being able to see where ads are or where analytics events are sort of very declaratively, it's actually very, very, very helpful. I mean, part of the answer could be that we could see where you know, our developers, you know, take all of this, you know, how much they use some script versus components. But part of it, we're also getting feedback that people wanted to be able to use our components outside of even AMP, which is why, you know, Bento project exists.
We have roughly 10 more minutes, so I'll take 2 or 3 more questions. The next one is, should publishers or companies be encouraged or penalized for favoring certain websites over others based on the underlying technology versus content? I think this is why I'm really excited about things like Core Web Vitals and Page Experience.
I'll try to take that one before. I think Malta wants to speak as well, but
I can take it first. I was just going to say no.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a very good answer. No, and I'm here like representing Microsoft and what we do for search, and like there are folks from Google here. For me, what matters, like the Web Vitals are a perfect picture of what matters for us. Like even though like Microsoft for Bing, we don't have the same thing as Web Vitals. Like we use very similar signals to do that, and what matters is performance, content. The underlying technology doesn't matter at all, right? You can use AMP, you can use any script, any framework. You can do all server-side rendering, all client-side. It doesn't matter. What matters is the page quick? Like, are the sign signals there? Is the content good? and so on and so forth. So the short answer, no, 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 no.
Yeah, I can echo that on the other side of the coin. There's a perception, I think, that you might do AMP for SEL, but having Core Web Vitals lets us point at the fact that, hey, the AMP pages are still faster. And as long as the AMP pages are faster, there's not much of an argument that we should switch it up.
I'll ask, I'll see if there's any more questions coming in, right? I feel like I don't have the memory to answer this question, but at the contributor summit, it was mentioned that AMP runtime might give you a PWA out of the box for navigating amongst AMP pages. Are there any updates on that? My recollection fails me here. I would say this is a great place to go plug the AMP project GitHub, which is go.amp.dev/github. And I'm sure somebody from the runtime or the performance working group can answer your questions there better.
I mean, and I'm not sure it's the same thing, but we do have a PWA runtime. For some historical reasons, I think it's been called shadow runtime. And it allows you to load a AMP document in a PWA using all the AMP technology, using possibly pre-rendering and everything else. There are, I think, a couple of good examples there as well.
A new question. Any chance that we'll have bento in reverse, which is letting folks leverage, say, React in an AMP page with AMP script, that is embed React in AMP versus embedding AMP in React? That is probably the second hardest sentence I've read today.
I mean, I'm guessing the end. So I feel like Dima can opine on this probably the best. But I'm guessing the answer is no.
Chris Baxter demoed this. It works.
Really?
Yeah.
Because my understanding is that the defining property that distinguishes, say, bento components from ones running in a fully validated AMP page is that there are certain constraints that cannot be assumed to hold once you start going beyond the boundaries of a valid AMP page. And once you unlock the ability to basically do anything with a framework, say, like React, then a lot of the constraints that the AMP components depend on in a fully validated AMP page probably can't hold anymore. But
I mean, Chris Baxter demoed this. I think there was, maybe you don't want to do it, but it's possible.
I would say something lighter like Preact, maybe? Go for it, Dima.
Yeah, we have AMP script, which has a fairly, unlimited amount of technologies that can be used with it and deployed there. React, we have examples in React and Preact. There are definitely limitations that, you could see what AMP wants to observe instead of AMP script, but it's basically an open-ended app that can be hosted inside of a separate thread. It has some sort of a sandbox around it, and it can be included on any AMP page.
Yeah, I think the demo that
it's kind of what I was talking earlier about, how like AMP kind of going away, and this is kind of this is the direction that all of this is kind of going to, right? You can definitely imagine stuff like this happening, and I think beyond the demo, you can actually do it today. It's definitely an interesting area of research how such programming models could look like in the future when it's all a little bit better tied together. But AMP script does put constraints on you. So for example, you can't just set up a timer and keep updating the page, right? Or so there's constraints like that because like you have to have a user action to make changes, and so those are definitely handled independent of whatever technology is actually used inside of the of the worker?
Actually, I think AmpScript can send timer. You just can't violate the sizing of a page, or the content layout shift basically constraints.
Right. Yeah, that's what I meant.
Also, the demo that Chris was alluding to was, I think, Chris's demo at AmpConf 2019, when we could all travel. So yeah, this is a great point to actually go plug the YouTube channel for the AMP project, which is youtube.com/theampproject, where if you find the talk for AmpScript, I'm sure you can find the video, as well as you can find the talks from yesterday as well, where everything from stories to email to things like core web vitals will also be covered. Since we're about like 3 minutes out, do folks have any last comments, questions from the TSC? Do folks have any like last things to say? Otherwise, I'll close this out. Perfect. Yeah, I guess with that, thank you to folks who are joining us, who took the time out to join us. It means a lot to get your feedback, to hear your questions, your concerns. And I'm sure like this just factors in very much into like the way the AMP project is run, all of your community feedback. So with that, thank you for joining us. I hope you all stay safe, are washing your hands, socially distancing, staying 6 feet apart, and taking care of yourselves and your family. Like this is no year like before, but I hope you're all taking care and staying safe. With that, thank you for joining us, to the members of the TSC here. And thank you for those who are joining us on the live stream. And also thank you to OpenJS for having us. Absolutely, like 100%. You've been great hosts, so thank you.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Nana.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nana.